Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving into Milton Friedman's Free to Choose,
Oh, yeah.
a book you clearly find fascinating. You've given us quite the stack of notes and highlighted passages.
It's a classic for a reason. Even decades later, Friedman's ideas on free markets, individual liberty, and the role of government still spark debate.
Okay, so before we get lost in the nitty-gritty, can you give us the TLDOR on Free to Choose? What are the big themes Friedman tackles?
In a nutshell, Friedman argues that free markets are not just the best engine for economic prosperity, but also the foundation for a free society. He systematically dismantles arguments for government intervention, from price controls to public education, showing how they often lead to unintended consequences that hurt the very people they're supposed to help.
That's a pretty bold claim. So where does he even begin to unpack all that?
He starts with what seems like a simple question.
Yeah.
How is a pencil made?
The pencil story, I remember that from your notes. It's become surprisingly famous.
Right. No single person on Earth knows how to make a pencil from scratch. It requires the coordination of thousands, from the people mining graphite in Sri Lanka to the timber workers in Oregon,
Wow.
all operating independently. Friedman uses this to illustrate the magic of the price system acting as an invisible hand to guide resources and incentivize cooperation, without a central planner dictating every move.
So it's kind of like how nobody controls the internet, but it just works.
Exactly. It's a beautifully decentralized system.
Mm.
Friedman argues that this same principle, applied to the economy as a whole, leads to greater prosperity than any centrally planned system ever could.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So what does Friedman say happens when governments try to control the economy?
He dives into that throughout the book, using real-world examples to show how even well-intentioned policies can backfire. One of his most compelling comparisons is between East and West Germany after World War II. Despite sharing a common heritage, East Germany's communist regime, with its centrally planned economy, led to stagnation and oppression. Meanwhile, West Germany, embracing free market principles, flourished.
That's a stark contrast. So he's saying that interfering with the free market doesn't just stifle economic growth, but it can also impact individual freedom.
Precisely. He argues that economic and political freedom are inseparable. When the government controls your livelihood, it ultimately controls many aspects of your life.
That's a sobering thought. He doesn't just stop at broad comparisons, though, does he? My notes mention something about gas lines.
Yes. He uses the oil crisis of the 1970s. Remember those images of cars lined up for blocks? He argues those shortages weren't caused by a lack of oil, but by government price controls that prevented the market from adjusting naturally. Instead of allowing prices to rise, signaling increased demand and encouraging conservation and new production, the controls created artificial shortages and long lines.
So kind of like how trying to hold back a flood just makes the eventual break even more chaotic.
Exactly. Friedman argues that these unintended consequences are a recurring theme with government intervention.
And this is just the beginning of his critique. Right, there's a whole stack of your notes still on the table. Where do we go from here?
You're absolutely right. We're just getting started. Friedman goes on to dismantle a whole range of government programs, arguing that they often fail to achieve their intended goals and create more problems than they solve.
So let's dive into some specifics. What kind of programs does he critique?
He takes aim at everything from Social Security and public housing to occupational licensing and the FDA. One of his central arguments is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every government program, every benefit comes with a cost. And those costs are often hidden, borne by taxpayers or future generations.
He uses the term invisible costs, doesn't he? It reminds me of that old saying, if you want to know who benefits from a policy, don't look at who it's supposed to help, look at who pays for it.
That's a great way to put it. For example, he argues that tariffs, which are often touted as protecting domestic industries, actually end up hurting consumers by raising prices and limiting choices.
So it's like trying to protect a tree by building a wall around it, but then it can't get any sunlight or nutrients.
Precisely. Friedman argues that true protection comes from competition, not from government shielding industries from it. He makes a similar argument about labor unions. While acknowledging their historical role in improving working conditions, he argues that today they often benefit their members at the expense of other workers and consumers by driving up costs and limiting job opportunities.
He seems to question the conventional wisdom on a lot of these issues. What about his views on equality? I remember that being a big part of my notes.
He tackles that head on, making a critical distinction between what he calls equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. He argues that while the former is essential for a free society, The pursuit of the latter can be dangerous and even lead to tyranny.
Can you unpack that a little? What does he mean by those two types of equality?
He argues that equality of opportunity means ensuring everyone has a fair shot at success regardless of their background. It's about creating a level playing field, not guaranteeing equal outcomes. He uses the analogy of a lottery. Everyone has an equal chance of winning, but we don't expect everyone to win.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does equality of outcome come in?
Friedman argues that forcing equal outcomes, often through wealth redistribution or government quotas, not only stifles individual initiative, but also requires a level of coercion that's incompatible with a truly free society. He uses historical examples like the Soviet Union to illustrate how attempts to engineer perfect equality often lead to tyranny and oppression.
So it's like saying that instead of trying to make everyone the same height, we should focus on giving everyone a sturdy ladder and let them climb as high as their talents and efforts will take them.
That's a great analogy. Friedman's argument isn't about ignoring inequality or dismissing the importance of social safety nets. He does advocate for a limited social safety net, but he believes the focus should be on empowering individuals to reach their full potential, not on trying to engineer equal outcomes.
This all ties back to his core belief in individual freedom and responsibility, doesn't it? He seems to argue that when people are free to make their own choices, even if those choices lead to different outcomes, society as a whole benefits.
Exactly. He has this famous line, "A society that puts equality in the sense of equality of outcome ahead of freedom will end up with neither equality nor freedom." He believed that true progress comes from individuals pursuing their own interests in a free market, leading to innovation, competition, and ultimately greater prosperity for everyone.
So what about his ideas for education? I remember highlighting a section where he proposes a pretty radical solution.
You're probably thinking about his argument for school vouchers. He was deeply critical of the traditional public education system, arguing that it often trapped children in failing schools based on their zip code rather than providing equal opportunities for all students.
That's a powerful point. I remember feeling like my own educational options were limited by where I grew up. So how would his voucher system work?
He proposed giving parents vouchers that represent their child's share of education funding, allowing them to choose any school, public or private, that meets their child's needs. He argued that this would introduce competition into the education market, encouraging schools to improve and innovate to attract students.
It almost sounds like applying free market principles to education itself. Didn't he address concerns that this would disadvantage lower-income families who might not have the same resources to navigate a more competitive system?
Absolutely. He argued that the voucher system could be designed to provide additional support to low-income families, ensuring they had the same opportunities to choose the best schools for their children. He believed that empowering parents rather than relying on a centralized bureaucracy was the key to improving educational outcomes for all.
It's fascinating how he weaves together his arguments for economic freedom with their potential social implications. He doesn't shy away from tackling complex issues, does he?
Not at all. And he does it all with this remarkable clarity of thought and writing. He avoids jargon and lays out his arguments in a way that's accessible to a wide audience, but his ideas are far from simplistic. They challenge conventional wisdom and force you to confront your own assumptions about the role of government in society.
So with all that said, what does Friedman ultimately see as the solution to the problems he identifies? Does he offer a path forward?
He does. He does. Free to choose is not just a critique of government intervention. It's a call to action. He urges readers to reclaim their individual responsibility, to embrace the power of the free market, and to demand a more limited role for government in their lives.
That's a pretty bold message. What's the main takeaway he wants readers to leave with?
Friedman wants us to recognize that while markets aren't perfect, they're still the best system we have for promoting both prosperity and freedom. He argues that when individuals are free to pursue their own interests, it unleashes a wave of innovation and creativity that benefits everyone.
So it's not just about self-interest, but about how self-interest, when channeled through the free market, can actually lead to broader social good.
Exactly. Think about the explosion of innovation we've seen in technology over the past few decades. That didn't happen because of some government mandate. It happened because entrepreneurs were free to take risks, to experiment, and to compete, driven by the desire to create something new and valuable.
That's a really interesting point. He's not saying greed is good, right?
Yeah.
More like individual drive when operating within a system of free exchange can lead to positive outcomes for everyone.
You got it. Friedman believed that the free market, for all its flaws, was ultimately a system that reflected human nature. with all its ingenuity and imperfections. He acknowledged that there will always be challenges, but he was optimistic that a society that embraced individual freedom and limited government would be best equipped to navigate those challenges and create a better future.
It's interesting that he ends on a note of optimism. With all the critiques he lays out, you might expect him to be more cynical.
He does acknowledge the challenges, but ultimately, Free to Choose is a hopeful book. He believed in the power of ideas to change the world, and he saw the growing interest in free market principles as a sign that people were waking up to the dangers of excessive government control.
It seems like his ideas have had a lasting impact. Even today, decades after it was published, people are still debating and discussing the ideas in Free to Choose.
Absolutely. His work helped to shift the conversation around the role of government and the power of free markets. And whether you agree with all his conclusions or not, there's no denying that his ideas have had a profound impact on economic policy, political discourse, and the way we think about freedom and prosperity.
It's a book that encourages us to question our assumptions, to think critically about the role of government in our lives, and to consider the potential of free markets to unleash human ingenuity and create a better world.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway of all. Friedman doesn't just want us to understand his arguments. He wants us to engage with them, to challenge them, and to use them as a springboard for our own exploration of these complex issues.
So for anyone listening who's been intrigued by our dive into Free to Choose, where would you recommend they go next? What are some questions they could explore further on their own?
That's a great question. I think it would be fascinating to consider how Friedman's arguments hold up in light of the challenges we face today, like climate change, income inequality, and the rise of automation. Would he offer different solutions? Or would he argue that the principles of free markets and individual liberty are even more relevant in our complex and interconnected world?
Those are some great questions to ponder. It seems like Free to Choose isn't just a book you read. It's a book you continue to think about and debate long after you've turned the last page.
Exactly. And that, I think, is a testament to the power and enduring relevance of Milton Friedman's work.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Free to Choose. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep those pages turning and those ideas flowing.